Alex is extraordinary. So he has ADHD. He is one of the pioneers of social media content, and so would have, I presume, happily understood my little conundrum that I had there. At 21, he founded Unilad and Lad Bible. He then fought and won a legal battle over ownership and successfully sold it. He has held a number of senior leadership positions, now runs his own podcast, ADHD Chatter, and has again built up a following of millions. In conversation, this is going to be a conversation with me about his entrepreneurship journey and what's happened. It's a fireside chat style. He is extraordinary. Like, he's done it multiple times, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have him here. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Henry. How are you?
I'm great. We can hear you loud and clear. Like, it's I am well. I think I'm looking pretty fresh for that now. Now in my 22nd hour or 23rd hour of this thing.
I was going to say congratulations. It must be quite an endurance exercise for you, this conference.
Yeah, it's my silly idea that a 24-hour conference would sort of be an interesting thing. I think the idea of bringing in other ADHD charities around the world, talking to a global audience, getting global speakers, like, is a wonderful thing, and has worked. And particularly creating sort of coalition of ADHD charities to make a difference, which has been great. Right, but this is not about me, much as I would like it to be. This is about you. You are amazing. Like, it's like you are you epitomize the. Like, I think in America, people make their business it's the story is I made it in the garage. We all look at them going, how have you got a garage? My house is like street parking. You did it in your student room. Like, do you want to tell us, or could you share with us that start? Like, what you did?
Yeah, so I went to university in 2010 after really feeling quite lost and not sure what else to do. I was terrified of the education system from day one. My earliest memory of being in school was one of the other kids saying to me, "You could be one of the cool kids, Alex, if you weren't so weird." And that was probably when I was about 6 or 7 years old. The following year, I had my first anxiety attack in a classroom. I remember sat at the back of the classroom quite happily, daydreaming, and the teacher, out of nowhere, pointed at me and said, "Alex, do you know the answer to this question?" And all of the kids naturally turned around to look at me. And in that moment, I felt my heart rate going up. And I remember abruptly standing up and running out of the classroom. And luckily, I found someone in the corridor, and I said, "Please help me, I'm having a heart attack, call an ambulance." And by the time the paramedic turned up, I had calmed down, and they had reassured me that, of course, I wasn't having a heart attack, I was having my first anxiety attack. And it was the juxtaposition between how I felt at school when I was in an environment that was very overstimulating for me, very noisy, very bright, against how I was presenting at home, and in an environment that was friendly for me. When I was at home, I was being very enterprising from a young age, starting businesses. I remember when I was about 8 going through my parents' board games and finding out all of the addresses written on them and all of the companies that manufactured them, and spending the summer holidays designing my own board game, making all the little pieces and designing the board, writing out all the instructions. And I sent my designs off to all these companies, and several weeks went past, I didn't hear anything. But then I eventually heard back from one, and they said, "Unfortunately, we're not looking for any new board game designs, but always lean into that entrepreneurial spirit." And that sort of continued really for the rest of my education, that sort of juxtaposition between what I was like at school and what I was like at home. When the time came to come to university, I really just went because I was convinced that's what everyone did. I went to university, I sat in my first lecture, and the lecturer didn't need to point at me and say anything. I felt that anxiety coming back. And I remember, again, leaving the lecture theatre and walking off this anxiety attack in the streets of Oxford. But I went back to my bedroom at university, and in my first year, I started a business called Quick Pizza, and it was a late night delivery service for students, and I impulsively spent half my student loan on this 6-foot freezer, carried it into my room with my housemate and filled it with Tesco pizzas, made a Facebook page called Quick Pizza, and if a student wanted a pizza in the middle of the night, they would text me. I would throw it in the oven, and eventually I had about 4 students working for me, cycling around Oxford, delivering pizzas to students in the middle of the night. But then the university shut me down because I didn't have a food safety hygiene certificate. But it was my second year that social media sort of really blew up and started becoming dominant on university campuses. And I remember just becoming absolutely obsessed with it. I can't explain the feeling when I became aware of Facebook. I remember sat in my bedroom for weeks, quite literally, to the point where my friends and family was quite concerned for my well-being, because it was very unusual behaviour, I think, to witness for someone who was, thought a student should be going out and being social and all this. And I was just sat in my room, absolutely obsessed with Facebook and growing Facebook pages. And that's when I started Lab Bible and Unilad. And I dropped out of university about a month later. I remember getting my first email from Domino's Pizza saying, ironically, a pizza company that was doing the delivery service well, offering me X amount of money to promote on Lab Bible, and that was it. I impulsively just dropped out of university and went to grow it back in my parents' house.
So this is wonderful. The entrepreneurial story there. I actually wasn't aware of the pizza. I thought that, crikey, like when he talks about being in school and the teacher, it's a really great example of a teacher, instead of helping, punishing, and instead of understanding you had an attention problem, just deciding to try and essentially publicly humiliate you into a heightened state so that you didn't do that again. And that just not being possible and having your first anxiety attack is, yeah. What do you think about that teacher now? Like, what do you think when you look back at that?
I've been back to the school and I've met the teacher again, and no hard feelings whatsoever. Wow. I've done talks at my old schools, which was amazing to do talks on ADHD and neurodiversity. We've come a long way from it's 30 years ago. I'm 36 now. And there just wasn't the conversation back then. They thought, no one knew what was wrong with me. There's more to that story. My parents, that really was my first anxiety attack. In the months that followed that, it got worse. My parents moved me from school to school. Nobody recognized that it was an issue, that there was something going on in terms of overstimulation, anxiety. They just thought, if we just move me to another school, that will solve it, because that seemed like a logical solution at the end to that problem. But of course it wasn't, because the problem was, or not the problem, but the issue was inside my head, and that followed me no matter what school I went to. But no, I've spoken to that teacher, and I've given them a hug, in the recent years, and there's no hard feelings whatsoever. I think they're so happy to hear how far the conversation's come, and just amazed to see that conversation is happening now, and we can look back at that through the lens of neurodiversity, and now I suspect undiagnosed ADHD. I know undiagnosed ADHD, and to see that what actually was going on, and it wasn't just me being distracted or fidgeting. I was doing those things so I could pay attention to what the teacher was saying. I was staring out the window and tapping my foot or fidgeting like we were all told off for. is actually what I needed to do in order to pay attention and to take in what the teacher was saying.
Yeah.
But of course, that went against the sort of stereotypical visual of what a well-behaved pupil should look like, and hence, the telling off that ensued, and therefore the feeling like you need to correct or change how you are in order to not be told off, which we know is masking and the dire consequences that can have in the long term. But yeah, that was 30 years ago. I know we've come a long way.
Well, you say that, but that story is getting repeated over this country still. Like it's, I think the energy point about fidgeting and moving, there's a real attitude for lots of people that the hyperactivity, it's kind of like a cat. Zoom, 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 and then relax. And you'll see, whereas personally, so I have some of the age of ADHD. I have to vent my energy all the time. There needs to be some kind of movement for me all the time. And it doesn't matter if I've done a lot of exercise. For some reason, I'm currently playing with a hose pipe attachment. That's a nice little swap. Like, what are the things we're playing with in our hands? So that looks like a nice, smooth, shiny stone.
Yeah, it's a thumb stone, which one of my podcast guests gave me because they noticed that I was moving my hands. They spoke to me afterwards and suggested, and I haven't stopped using it since. It's brilliant. It's just, it's I don't like the word fidget toys tremendously. I think but it does help me channel that energy. That if I don't channel it into something, it can often end up in my head, which can therefore create a lot of anxiety and an inability to focus on what is gonna.
That's such a lovely phrase. Like, if I don't have it, it'll end up in my head. A lot of people talk about the hyperactivity in their brain, the movement of the ideas, of the thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think exercise for me is one of and just movement. And this is how I create movement when I'm not able to go physically, like situations like this or in meetings, which although I advocate for walking and movement in meetings, often that's not possible in reality. So like
some other people don't like it so much.
Exactly, yeah. So yeah, it's called a thumb stone, and nice. It's very beneficial.
There are three things amazing about it. One, obviously, that it's not really working for you. Two, that you've not lost it. And three, you've not gone past a body of water and looked at it and gone, man, this would skip so well.
Now I'm thinking if there's any lakes nearby.
Right. You've talked about family. You talked about leaving university, which your parents must have been thrilled about. We'll skip past their reaction. What was their reaction? Run me through that conversation. Hi, Mum, Dad.
So it was a very awkward drive back from Oxford to Eastbourne, which is my hometown and where they lived, because I was giving up on a degree which is still in a lot of families the thing to aspire to achieve, and I was giving up all of that for a silly Facebook page, which there was no precedent for. There was no case study of Facebook pages turning into businesses. But my parents have always supported me and always believed in me, which I think is a massive privilege and a massive, obviously, an advantage. There was no suggestion that it wouldn't work. They very much picked me up and allowed me to work with it. So I have to give them tremendous credit in this situation. I think many others would have had more pressure on them to stay in university and to not pursue a Facebook page, which Facebook didn't exist 12 months prior, and there were certainly no examples of it turning into a business where you can make money from it. But they completely supported me. I moved back to my hometown, and I started building it over the next 12 months. This is where I fell into issue, because the creativity that enabled me and the impulsivity that enabled me to start these two brands was brilliant. And I strongly associate, I think, my ability to spot patterns and predict trends on social media was a big factor in the early stages of those two social media brands. What I wasn't so good at was other areas that are required in a scaling business, like accountancy and dealing with brand negotiations. So I needed help because I had UniLoud on one screen and I had LabBible on another screen. And I put out an advert for some assistance, and these two people responded, and I met up with them in a bar in Brighton. And I remember that day so well. We walked from the train station down to this bar on Brighton Pier, and my intuition was screaming at me that day that these two people were not on my side. But because I'm a massive people pleaser and not so much anymore, but at the time, massive people pleaser and terrified of confrontation, I signed the bit of paper that was presented to me that day, which was a partnership agreement. We were all going to go into this business 33%, 3 ways, and I signed it. I didn't listen to my intuition that was telling me these two people were perhaps sinister, and I signed the bit of paper, and a week later I had been kicked out of the business, completely removed from the Facebook page, the bank accounts, everything associated with the business I no longer had access to. And that was a real moment. I remember just staring at my computer screen, recognizing that I had been removed from everything, and the terror that I felt, like the anxiety, and I buried my head in the sand for about a month. I didn't know what to do. Eventually, my friend, who had some legal advice, legal background, looked at the partnership agreement and encouraged me and persuaded me to go to see a solicitor finally. And I did. And I remember the solicitor looked at this and he said, well, firstly, they're not legally allowed to do what they've done, but if you want to fight this is going to end up in court. This is going to go to trial. And I remember when my solicitor told me that, the image of me standing on the witness box in front of a room full of the press, their lawyers, my mind sort of flashed forward into the future, and I envisaged myself stood on the witness box with everyone looking at me. And of course, my mind flashed back to my experience at school, and I got in the car, left my solicitor's office, and went and bought a bottle of vodka. And I can only tell you what the nurse told me the following morning when I woke up in hospital. She said that members of the public had found me in an alleyway, clutching a bottle of vodka, and they tried to approach me. I tripped, slipped, and hit my head on the wall, and they called an ambulance. And as the nurse was telling me this, I remember feeling this shame and anxiety come back to me. And I knew that I thought at the time, the only solution to this anxiety was more alcohol. And I remember trying to stand up from the hospital bed, running out of the ward to the nurse saying, "Alex, where are you going?" But I ran past her, tried to escape the hospital, and security got me. And before I knew it, I was in the back of a police car with my parents looking at me through the window with this look of fear and desperation in their eyes. They didn't know what was wrong with me, and they didn't know how to help me. That took me to AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. That was the first time I heard the 4 letters ADHD in AA meetings, but I didn't think that much of it. Fast forward a couple of months, it was the trial in London, and I got through the trial. I had to be chaperoned from the hotel room to the court to make sure that I didn't go and buy more vodka. That was the seriousness of the compulsion that I had towards dealing with anxiety at the time. But I stood on the witness box and I answered the questions. I had to take numerous breaks to to allow myself to manage the anxiety. I had a number of anxiety attacks in the toilet, in the courtroom, but I got through it. And fast forward again a couple of months still, and my solicitor called me and he said, "Alex, are you on your own?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "You've won everything. You've won both of the companies back." And of course, it was a huge 5-year legal battle. But ultimately for me, it was a massive mental health battle that nearly cost my life on numerous occasions through alcohol. And that was back in 2018.
It's an incredible story. It's obviously awful. How are you doing with alcohol now?
Yeah, a lot better. I mean, I have so much more awareness now around what conditions that I'm able to drink in and what I'm not able to drink in. I mean, if I'm completely honest, I refer to myself as an alcoholic, a recovering alcoholic, because if I have a drink, it sets off this compulsion that means that I'm unable to stop drinking. And even still, because there's more to that story, I thought that I was drinking in response to the court case anxiety, which I very much was doing at the time. But I booked a holiday to Las Vegas after I won the court case, thinking all's well, all's good, all's amazing. And I nearly died in Las Vegas. I couldn't stop drinking, and there was no court case anxiety there. I had won. Everything was great. I was, a young legal winner in the press. Everything looked fantastic, but I was getting kicked out of casinos in Las Vegas and breaking up with my partner because I couldn't control my drinking. There was more there. There was something going on in my head that I still wasn't aware of at that stage.
Wow. Yeah, and what did you do next? So you got it back. I don't quite understand how that works. Like, so because they've taken everything, the whole thing from you. Do you suddenly, because you go to Vegas, so who's running the company now? Like, how's it functioning?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I never actually went back to take control of the brands, because I had been out of the companies for 5 or 6 years during the legal process. So when I won the court case, there was a process of, essentially, it's the boring details, but there was a third-party company that kind of went in to manage the brands during the transitional period to make sure, because there were hundreds of jobs, at stake, and there was a company that needed to continue to run. So there was a third-party company that went in to maintain the momentum. The decision was ultimately made for me to sell the company, because I had been out of it for so long and I couldn't just walk in having no real understanding of the different mechanisms, because I had been out of it for so long. So I sold the company after I had won the court case.
No, well, it's a big deal to make such that kind of decision. And obviously, congratulations on achieving that. I'm just going to do a very quick recap, because I think people might miss like how a Facebook page has value. Could you just outline to people like how that works?
Yeah, so I mean, it was so much more than a Facebook page by that stage. It was a network of Facebook pages, Instagram accounts, TikTok, YouTube channel of hundreds of millions of followers, and that exposure, that reach to that audience is very valuable to brands who want to reach them. So essentially, it became a marketing agency of dealing with brands, Domino's Pizza, the very earliest one, but companies, brands that wanted exposure to those hundreds of millions of followers. There would be a brand partnership that occurred. So that's where the revenue came from.
Oh, great, thank you. Just always useful people to depending on their understanding. Right. So you've sold it. Like, what? Actually, like, I just want to scroll back. What was it like during those years? Like, you're watching it build and build and build. What were you doing? Like, how are you occupying yourself, or is it entirely lost into drink? Like,
Yeah, so the drink came in waves, really. There were moments that because if you zoom out and look at the legal process over 5 years, I don't know how much you want to go into the boring details, but
oh yeah, you're okay.
there's long periods of very much of where nothing much happens. At the early stages, you send a legal letter, and then you might wait 3 months, and you get a reply, and it's just letter after letter, and that can go on for years. And then towards the end, it escalated to court hearings in London, negotiation meetings in legal offices, and then eventually the trial. So the drinking escalated as we got towards the end. During the first 2-3 years, I had to find a job to pay for my legal fees. I got a job in London at a marketing agency, funnily enough, doing essentially what I would be doing if I had control of the companies that I was fighting for. So I was building Facebook pages in a company called Hello You in London. I did that for a year. And then I got a job funnily enough, I got a job in a marketing agency in Manchester, and I was brought in to grow their Facebook pages because they needed help. So I went up to Manchester, and I remember sat in the office, and it was a very busy office, a very loud. There was a table tennis table, there was a dog running around, there was music playing, there was an office slide, you go down it into a ball pit. A very fun office traditionally. But I remember just feeling absolutely overstimulated and paralyzed mentally in that environment. I was unable to grow their Facebook. Within 3 months, I'd grown it from 0 to 5,000. And then I moved on to another marketing agency shortly afterwards. I had to leave that one. And in this new agency, I asked them if I could, work downstairs where it was quiet in the canteen sometimes, if I could sometimes work from home, and ultimately if you could trust me on my outcomes, judge me on my outcomes rather than my processes. And my new boss said yes. And in the same time period, I had grown their Facebook from 0 to 8 million followers. And it's a very, I think, clear example of how very basic accommodations can make a massive difference to someone's output. So I was working in that agency then. That's the new agency in London that I worked for. So I was working jobs, having to earn money to pay for my legal fees to win my company back. After I won what led me to get my ADHD diagnosis, after I won and sold the companies after the court case, I wanted to start a podcast called Walk Away Wiser. It was to be a business podcast, and I remember having the idea, and I impulsively spent a small fortune on 7 cameras. I dismantled my bed. I was going to turn my bedroom into a soundproof studio, and I did it. And I ordered all of the foam panels, tripods. I hired a producer, I hired a director. And then when the postman delivered all of my camera equipment about 3 days later, I remember sat on my sofa just looking at this pyramid of Amazon boxes with no interest in this podcast anymore. And I couldn't understand the difference between my enthusiasm 3 days ago compared to the absolute lack of interest I had in this project at that moment. And the producer that I hired said to me, "So when did you get your ADHD diagnosis?" And I looked at him and said, "What do you mean?" And that was the second time I'd heard those 4 letters. And that's what started me on my journey. And shortly after that, the psychiatrist told me that my ADHD was clear as hell. And I had so much. And after my diagnosis, that's when I wanted to learn about ADHD. And I thought, because I had so much time, I might as well make the conversations public. And that's how I started ADHD Chatter. And funnily enough, the difference between that podcast and why ADHD Chatter as a podcast has worked, I believe, and why my original concept failed, is because I went too fast, too early with Walk Away Wiser. I very much all or nothing. and I burnt myself out. I became overwhelmed. Whereas with with ADHD Chatter, I started very small, very slowly in my office. I didn't spend a fortune on cameras. I didn't book huge, complicated guests requiring logistics to get them to a studio. I just put it on my computer. I did it virtually. I booked a couple of guests of people I speak to on LinkedIn, and I did the first 20 episodes in my office at home on my computer like this. And then once I had learned the basics, I then scaled up to a studio in Battersea, which is where I now film the podcast. And a year and a half later, you know, it's 3 million followers and hundreds of thousands of listeners every month. And I think it's so important with ADHD, whatever we do, whether it's business or a hobby or a new project, is to really try and put a breaker between the initial excitement and going all or nothing. I refer to it as like this metaphorical idea shelf, where if we have an idea, we try and force ourselves to not action it straight away. We put it on a metaphorical shelf, the idea shelf, and if it's still pulling at our interest 2 weeks later, then there might be something there. That means perhaps that idea is actually connected with our core intrinsic values, which therefore means it will be able to sustain it because our motivation will be the long term, as opposed to actioning an idea based on short-term excitement and impulsivity, which, from my experience, particularly with ADHD, and my experience and the people I've spoken to on my podcast, is we're very good at starting stuff. We can very much impulsively buy the domain, do all the branding, like I did with that podcast, in a very short space of time, but then we burn out and ultimately abandon the idea. Whereas if we try and put a breaker between the idea and actually taking that first step, then we can really separate the ideas that are being fueled by our intrinsic motivations and core values versus the ones that are being fueled by a short-term excitement.
I think it's a really valuable point. It's really interesting. So when we look at sort of the positive of ADHD, one of the slugs is on creativity, and part of how that works is the impulsivity to do makes us more likely to have created, to create it. There's no point having an idea if you don't action it. It's nothing. But it's a double-edged sword, because if that idea is great, then wonderful. If that idea is not great, well, then you've just lost a lot of money and time. And I think that you often get sort of taught a negative, which is you should pause before you do something, count to 10, or take longer. And it's very much framed around stopping you doing bad things. I really like the way you reframe that into a positive, that you put things on the idea shelf, and if it's still of interest a time later, then maybe it's worth looking at harder, because it's sort of past that initial threshold, and it's a great way to filter the chaos of the ideas of all the things we're thinking of. I also, when we talk about, we've got a section coming up on to-dos called "To Doing the To-Dos," and one of the things the coaches there talk about is that to-do lists get overwhelmed, that you're constantly the memory issues that often, and the huge number, the racing brain and all the ideas mean that this list gets just saturated and then becomes a new page, a new list, new this, and if you have a dumping ground list, a list for, like, your much better phrasing of an idea shelf, where you put things on the idea shelf and let them mature, then it stops your main list getting overwhelmed, because you've got a place for this stuff. And so I think it's a really, really powerful idea from multiple levels.
I think it's also really important to say that this has to happen simultaneously with a sort of continuous effort to build one's self-awareness. At the end of the day, really journal, really meditate, or weekly, however often you can do it, and really ask yourself, and honestly ask yourself, what happened in that time period, that day, that made you feel happy, what made you feel sad, what did you enjoy, what did you struggle with. And if you do that often enough, you can build up an arsenal of self-awareness that will give you an edge in many areas of life, but also you'll be able to understand what items on your idea shelf are connected with your core values. It's so important, especially I think with the ADHD community, is when we embark on new projects, the ones that are going to sustain our attention are the ones that are going to be connected to our intrinsic core beliefs. So we have to work on understanding what those beliefs are, especially when so many of us are disconnected from our true selves through a lifetime of masking and all of that, which is a different conversation, but it is connected. I think so many people in the community don't understand, haven't got enough awareness or clear enough awareness who they actually are, through reasons that are out of their control and are not their fault because they've been felt to feel different their entire life. So I think for the ADHD community and neurodivergent community in general, it's particularly important to work on those self-awareness exercises, areas and as often as you can, to ensure that you have a definition of who you really are, because only when you have that can you embark on a project, because a project that's going to sustain your attention enough for it to turn into a long-term success.
Knowing yourself is one of the critical aspects of being successful with ADHD. Like a way we try and frame it is everyone to succeed has to be positive, has to play to their strengths, balls to their weaknesses, and for us that's more so. And stronger strengths, weaker weaknesses, and we got to know them. And we are going to be wanting to do things differently. I thought your vignette talking about working and recognizing you need to do it differently. You had to be in the quiet bit. You had to working from home is going to make a big difference, and being able to have that happen. We've come to the end of time, and so I'm supposed to say, like, what's next? Like, what do you hope for in the next period?
So my plan is to continue building the podcast. I think the podcast is such a passion project of mine, and I think my motivation comes from the injustice that I feel that so many people in the community face. Fueled by it has to be, I think, fueled by your own experience partly, and it has been by my experience mainly at school. I want to continue building the podcast. I want to continue inviting a diverse range of guests onto the podcast, a mixture of life story episodes and academics, to really get a blend of lived experience.
Good one coming on.
Exactly.
We have Jessica Eccles coming on shortly, who's incredible.
I think, if you Google ADHD or you ask a doctor, they'll tell you it's a neurodevelopmental difference disorder characterized by traits of impulsivity and forgetfulness. But I genuinely believe it's more. I think it's a lifetime of being told you're too much and you're too sensitive and not understanding why you have to adjust who you are, shapeshift in order to fit in. I want people to have that realization as early as possible, so they don't go a lifetime of pretending to be someone that they're not. And the earlier the better. We can all realize that we're not broken. We are just perhaps a little bit different, and that we have always been enough. That's my goal for the podcast, to provide a platform that broadcasts that message time and time again.
That's a wonderful, it's a wonderful uplifting note to end on. You've been amazing. I've really been grateful for this, and I found it absolutely fascinating. I had and your candor and honesty and deep thought that belies your answers is just wonderful. And I've learned a lot, and I'm sure others have too. So thank you, and thank you for obviously what you're doing in ADHD Chatter and the podcast. It's a big deal. I have to say goodbye, which makes me sad, but thank you so much. You have a great rest of your day, and thank you.